Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a face-off between a couple of hookers with a heart of gold in Alan J. Pakula's Klute versus Garry Marshall's Pretty Woman. And, this was an interesting one to get through. They both are films that center around a romance between a prostitute and another man. And so let's just dive right into Klute, starring Jane Fonda in an Oscar-winning role and quite possibly her best performance of her career, and Donald Sutherland, who plays the title character Klute. And Donald Sutherland's character, he's assigned to find a missing person. He's a private investigator, and then the missing person is also a good friend of his, a prominent businessman in Pennsylvania. And so Klute's got to go to New York to try to find him, because there's been a connection with a prostitute played by Jane Fonda. And at this point in time, Jane Fonda's kind of out of the life. She turns a few tricks here and there just to like make ends meet when she doesn't have any modeling or acting gigs and stuff. And so right there's a heavy connection to Jane Fonda with this character, because she was a model and an actress, still an actress. And at this point, very as desynthesized to that life as her character is, because she had been in the game for about 15 years, and she was at a point in her career where that, the being the daughter of one of the greatest, or one of the most, I'm gonna say greatest, but one of the most iconic of the old Hollywood actors, Henry Fonda, and somebody that definitely epitomized like the all-American ideal and shit. And so, but given her the Vietnam bullshit and stuff. So, but those scenes that she has with the shrink, where she kind of just bears all, some of the most honest acting, not just from Jane Fonda, but just from any actress, that's been through, all of that rigmarole of trying to just make it, or at least just get, solid paying gigs and stuff. But she meets this detective, John Klute, and, she doesn't want to talk to him at first. He's a private investigator, this guy can go fuck himself type thing. But then he ends up blackmailing her by recording like phone calls of her turning tricks and stuff. And so, she helps him just to get the tapes back and shit. But then somehow through there, a romance kind of blossoms. And, it starts out with some weird like psychosexual giallo type shit. And, it's like, then it weirdly, the sex isn't that overstated anyways, even when she, turning tricks, the sex done very tastefully. And of course, there's probably something that a stipulation of Jane Fonda's, she probably didn't want, she already bare it all in Barbarella, so she probably wasn't really trying to show everything else, so basically though, it's more, and honestly, the prostitution thing is almost a metaphor for acting and stuff. And of course, she also directs Klute to her former pimp, played brilliantly by Roy Scheider, one of the first of many white pimps in the cinema. And but the film itself is a very solid like noir thriller. And the cinematography by Gordon Willis, he's one of those few cinematographers that prove you can really do like noirish films with color, all the shadows and all that shit, stark contrasts and all that jazz. And and then even the ending is perfect. It's a lot more of an adult film, because there's great sequences where you kind of see Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland's characters falling in love. And he even rescues her in the end, but where it kind of falls into it is where it doesn't, like, they don't really end up together. It's not really that fairy tale shit like in Pretty Woman. But what's funny is like Pretty Woman is just as sleazy as Klute. When you look at it on on the surface, it's just like this beautiful like Hollywood fairy tale with two very charming actors, Richard Gere and Julia Roberts. But when you really look at the film, and then the characters, it's a very well written movie. It trope city, but they know how to like manipulate those tropes into a story and stuff. Because the beginning of the film, when you're introduced to Richard Gere's character Edward, he's on the phone arguing with his girlfriend, because she doesn't really want to be at his beck and call type shit. And, he needs her to be there in LA that week, for his business dealings. So it looks like he's, not a total piece of shit, because at least one person can stand him. And so like, that gets broken off. And so then he ends up inadvertently running into this, lovely prostitute played by Julia Roberts. And granted, not all like prostitutes look like Julia Roberts. So this is like, typical Hollywood glossy bullshit. But where it like kind of drifts away from that from a moment is when you see the dynamic of how they do it, because this guy, he's a ruthless business guy, cutthroat, his whole thing is about making deals. You get from him like he's more more about making deals than he is about fucking. Like, you know, sure, you know, everybody likes to get a good piece of ass every once in a while, but, you know, it's all about business with this. Guy don't even take a day off. But he kind of sees an opportunity where he can, like, you know, manipulate a woman just by having her as an employee and stuff. You know, as he's watching her watch TV on the floor eating strawberries and shit, you can kind of see it get working in his mind. But with Richard Gere playing it, you kind of can you can almost be fooled to think that he's falling in love instantly. This dude ain't even really thinking about that. You know, he's already, you know, writing up a contract and stuff, and, you know, pitching a fucking employment deal. You know, it's only going to last for a week. You get paid $3,000, you know, basically the girlfriend experience, so to speak. And, you know, but then later on, you know, and it's what's also funny too is while by being with this woman, he kind of realizes how much of a whore that he is. And, you know, through all that shit, that's where it starts to get a little corny and stuff. You know, the romance comes in, you know, where it starts out as business, you know, the usual drama shit comes in the way, you know, like there's another slick dick in the mix, you know, there's like, oh, I like you talking to that dude. And, you know, and then there's the sleazy ass lawyer of his played by Jason Alexander. Once he finds out she's a prostitute, then he tries to get all in there and stuff. And, you know, and then gets mad because, you know, well, it's really good pussy and made this dude a human being, and, you know, ain't gonna make me as much money and shit, you know. So it's one of those movies, definitely a sleazy fairy tale, you know. And, you know, and the ending itself is kind of lame, you know, because it's like, granted, yet again, Hollywood fairy tale, of course, it's going to end on a happy note. People wouldn't have it any other way, but would have been a lot better of a movie had they not ended up together. Because, like, much like in Klute, you know, that fucking voiceover of Jane Fonda talking to the shrink as they're, like, leaving her apartment after they're, you know, after she's moving out of it and shit, she understands, like, it's not going to work out, you know, I'm going to miss the hell out of him, but, you know, it's never gonna be a thing, you know. And they understand that in Pretty Woman, you know, they kind of have that adult conversation. If it just ended there and then they went their separate ways, it would have been a lot more, you know, powerful of a movie. But ain't nobody asking for that in glossy Hollywood bullshit. But maybe I am. I don't fucking know. Because in the 70s, Klute, I wouldn't necessarily call it the glossy Hollywood bullshit, but it was kind of that same, you know, titillating bullshit. But it just knew how to end it properly, you know, making movies for adults, so to speak. And, you know, even that whole, like, you know, it does the whole, you know, she comes, rescues her, or he comes and rescues her, you know, driving up in the white limo that's supposed to be the white horse, and, you know, and climbs up the fucking thing, and he's afraid of heights this whole time. He's got to overcome that fear to really get to make the plunge type shit. Real heavy-handed, tropey bullshit. And also, that's another thing, that the trope that's been used a million times. Anytime there's a hardened character, in a way to make him sensitive, they get him to play a musical instrument. Usually it's the fucking saxophone or the piano. And this one, it's the piano that he's playing and shit. It's real sensitive, you know. And yeah, that bathtub scene is sexy, you know. You know, if only therapy was like that, I would probably go to therapy. But it's not. And so, you know, there's a lot of great sexy elements and shit. But like with Klute, you don't see all the fucking bells and whistles. And it's even more of a profound, like, romance and a profound film, you know. Some of the shots and the way they do the thriller, it's like, I'm not even going to give away who the killer was, because it doesn't even doesn't do anything to point that out, you know. And it also, you know, definitely watch Klute to see. You could probably see it coming a mile away. Matter of fact, they tell you who the fuck it is in the beginning, and, you know, hell, even Pretty Woman could have turned into a fucking murder mystery or some shit. Like, maybe Richard Gere is not an only child in the movie. You know, maybe his sister was like a prostitute. She's killed in the beginning of the movie, and then Julia Roberts helps. In fact, that would have been an even better fucking movie. But instead, you get kind of a Pygmalion type thing where, like, he's grooming her to be like the perfect, like, wife type thing, or girlfriend, just whatever the fuck woman he can use to do what, you know. But then it's like, oh no, it's the fairy tale. What happens after he rescues her? She rescues him right back. And, you know, that is some fucking corn dog bullshit. So if you just, you know, that's why Klute wins this round clearly, because not only is it an entertaining film, but it ends on a very mature adult ending. You know, and maybe I'm an asshole, but, you know, I like a little truth in the cinema, but it's also got to be a good movie. And Klute's more than a good movie. Definitely the best movie that Alan J. Pakula made. And, you know, his only other good one, probably All the President's Men, Pakula being very mid. But, you know, Garry Marshall was, like, really good at doing the poppy shit. And like I said, Pretty Woman's really well done. Hector Elizondo's great in the film. A lot of great actors and moments. But as a whole movie, is kind of bullshit. Because you know Jane Fonda's a better actress than Julia Roberts, but Julia Roberts may be hotter, you know, and you know there's Richard Gere and Donald Sutherland probably are on the same level of acting. Donald Sutherland may be better, may have been a better actor, rest in peace. But you know, all in all, that's why the 70s are as great as they are. Stuff like Klute, and so that's why the 70s win this round. And for anybody keeping score, that's now 21-22. 90s are still up by 1, but like I said, the 70s, man, they've been scrambling to get back on top. And it, you know, it's shit like Klute that made the 70s great, and stuff like Pretty Woman that made the 90s bullshit, you know, because it's gaslighting. That's what the fuck it is. You know, we're all convinced these movies are great, and it's like a way, it would have been like, if you'd have played more on the sleaze, it would have been, and that's what the 70s were really good at. They're really good at playing on the sleaze and making the sleaze look good. You know, you didn't have to tack on a happy ending to make the sleaze look good. The sleaze kind of spoke for itself. But like I said, if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, or any ideas, collaborations, you know, hit me up in the comments. You know, I have no life. That's why I keep doing these videos and stuff, you know, mapping out the rough draft of my doctoral thesis, because I got to know which one's better. You know, it's straight up sizzling. You know, summer's coming to a close, but this shit's only heating up.